The winter of 1944 struck Europe with a silence colder than any snow. In the heart of Bastogne, where the forests stood frozen in time, soldiers no longer fought just against the enemy. They fought to hold on to what was true. Winston Churchill had come to the front to see with his own eyes what reports could never fully explain. The 101st Airborne held the line alongside British commandos, tired but unbroken. Among them, a name surfaced that stopped Churchill in his tracks: Captain Nathan Ward, a man he trusted, a soldier who had led with courage, now accused of turning against his own. Churchill knew something was wrong. He remembered the missions, the loyalty, the dog named Bravo who never left Nathan's side. The accusation didn't fit. It felt like the truth had been left out in the cold. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. He simply said, "Too much silence often means something has been hidden." From that moment on, he was determined to find out what had really happened. Because in war, not every wound is visible, and not every hero wears a medal. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. The cold walls of the outpost barely muffled the storm brewing outside, but inside, another kind of storm had already taken hold. Captain Nathan Ward sat in silence, his wrists bound, his uniform soiled by hours of interrogation. His face, once known for calm determination, now showed the quiet disbelief of a man wrongfully accused. The evidence was thin, built on shadows and assumptions. A weapon had been found near him, yes, but it hadn't been fired. His words were dismissed, his loyalty questioned. Not far from the holding tent, Bravo, his trusted military dog, paced restlessly in a metal cage. Once praised for his sharp instincts and countless successful missions, Bravo now wore a new label: dangerous. The camera he had carried on his last mission had been confiscated, its recordings damaged. Some claimed it had been tampered with. Others didn't care. The silence around it spoke louder than the truth it might have held. Winston Churchill arrived at the camp under a heavy sky, his coat dusted with snow. Soldiers saluted, but their eyes were filled with uncertainty. Whispers had already spread. A captain under arrest, a war dog locked away. And behind it all, a man, leading the charge, Major Charles Whitmore. Churchill remembered Whitmore well. They had served in Sicily, shared long nights around war maps, and even longer days in the aftermath of decisions that left scars. But Whitmore had changed. Time and war had carved something colder into him, ambition wrapped in discipline, but without compassion. In a private meeting, Churchill leaned on his cane, gazing out a frost-covered window as his advisor entered. Without turning, he spoke quietly, but with weight. "There are men," he said, "who wear the uniform not for duty, but to shield themselves from the weight of their own wrongs." That sentence hung in the air like smoke. He knew Whitmore's kind. Officers who built walls of rules to hide behind, while braver men fell without justice. Meanwhile, Ward remained silent through the accusations, refusing to plead or point fingers. He believed the truth would rise, that someone, somewhere, still trusted him. But Churchill could see the pattern forming. The pieces didn't add up. An honorable man with no clear motive. A camera that could have revealed everything, now conveniently ruined. And a dog trained never to attack unless under direct command, suddenly branded a threat. Two heroes brought down not by failure but by a system too tired or too afraid to search for the truth. In war, not every wound is physical. Some are carved in trust, in dignity, in silence that should never have been allowed to grow. Churchill ordered to see, and Bravo personally. The handlers hesitated. "He's been aggressive, sir," one of them warned. Churchill waved the concern away. Inside the holding area, the dog stood still at first, tense. Then, the moment he saw Churchill, something shifted. Bravo's posture softened. He let out a quiet whine and sat, tail thudding once against the cold floor. The Prime Minister knelt slowly, eyes fixed on the animal. "They always know," Churchill murmured, gently touching the dog's collar. "They know who we are, long before we know ourselves." The bond between Ward and Bravo had never been just tactical. It was forged in the fire of frontline missions, of silent signals under gunfire, of shared nights in the mud with only each other for warmth. And now both stood accused, not because they failed, but because someone needed a story that would distract from the truth. Churchill left that cell with something burning beneath the surface. He had seen many battles. He had sent men into the fire. But this felt different. This was a betrayal not of orders or strategy, but of character. And that to him was something far more dangerous than any weapon. The snow continued to fall, covering the outpost in a quiet, heavy stillness. But deep inside, Churchill had already made a decision. This was not over, and he would not let history forget the difference between silence and justice. The skies over France remained grey as Captain Nathan Ward was placed in a military vehicle, his hands cuffed, his eyes steady. The wheels turned toward Reims, where he would be held in a secure detention centre. No trial, no audience, just another file in a drawer, another soldier swept aside by suspicion. But Winston Churchill wasn't ready to let him disappear. From a dimly lit command tent near the front, Churchill sat at a narrow desk, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his shoulders. He took up his pen, not to draft orders, but to write letters. One by one, he addressed commanders across the Allied ranks, not typed notes, handwritten letters, demanding access to the reports, the testimonies, the photographs, all of it. "Because if we allow war to swallow our sense of justice," he said aloud to the room, "what will remain of us when the war is done?" His words weren't meant for applause. They weren't even meant to be remembered. But those around him, aides and officers alike, felt the stillness that followed them. The kind of silence that didn't come from fear, but from truth, finally spoken. As the letters went out under military seal, Churchill remained in France, refusing to retreat to safer ground. His presence near the front lines was no longer symbolic. It was personal. He knew the pattern too well. Soldiers like Ward, quiet, loyal, uncompromising, often disappeared when their presence became inconvenient, when their integrity exposed cracks in the chain of command. He had seen it before, and now he saw it again. In a cold cell in Reims, Nathan Ward stared at the concrete wall in front of him. His uniform had been stripped of insignias, his name replaced by a number stamped on a folder. No visitors, no updates, just silence. The kind of silence that sinks into the soul. But Churchill never once referred to him as a prisoner. To him, Ward was more than a man under arrest. He was the face of every soldier left behind by the system, every name forgotten beneath paperwork, every quiet act of courage buried in bureaucracy. And that thought followed Churchill, like a shadow. He paced at night, walking alone through the frost-covered camp, not to be seen, not to inspire, but because something inside him refused to rest. He spoke little, but his mind raced. The war would not be won only with weapons and victories. No, it would be decided in the moments no one watched, in the choices made when the world wasn't looking. In the end, Churchill understood something that few ever spoke aloud. Wars are not just fought on the battlefield. They are fought in silence, in forgotten rooms, in the thin line between truth and convenience. And now, it was time to bring that silence into the light. The wind howled across the French countryside, tugging at the edges of the tents and whispering through the trees like a restless memory. Inside a dim command post, a worn envelope arrived in silence, delivered by a young courier with no idea of its weight. It was an old report, faded, creased at the corners. Churchill unfolded it slowly, his breath quiet, his expression sharpening with each line he read. It had been written by Sergeant Émile Tremblay, a Canadian soldier stationed near the Belgian border. Weeks before his untimely end, Tremblay had raised an alarm that no one had dared to echo. The words on the page were direct but heavy. He spoke of a smuggling network buried deep within Allied ranks. A name stood out: the Crows. That's what he had called them. Soldiers in uniform, but loyal to no one. Trading supplies, weapons, even information. Hidden under the fog of war. Churchill read the final paragraph twice, then a third time. He didn't speak at first. He only stared at the paper, eyes clouded with thought. Then, almost to himself, he said, "This man gave his life trying to warn us, and now another is paying the price for listening." The room fell quiet. Those present knew what that meant. Without hesitation, Churchill turned to his inner circle. His voice, though calm, carried a force that left no room for doubt. He called for Anaïs Fournier. Anaïs had survived the worst of the occupation in Paris. Once a translator and cryptographer for the resistance, she had seen how truth could be buried beneath symbols, how lies could be written in invisible ink. She had lost family, friends, but not her fire. And now that fire was needed once more. Her mission was simple in words, but dangerous in practice: uncover what had been erased. She arrived at the forward camp just before dusk, wrapped in a long coat, her expression steady and unreadable. Churchill met her personally, offering not orders but trust. He handed her the report, and with it the weight of a soldier's last message. "There are things hidden here," he told her, "not just files, but intent. Someone silenced this man, and now they're trying to bury another. I won't let them." Anaïs said little. She didn't need to. Her eyes moved across the report like someone scanning old wounds. To her, language was more than words. It was patterns, disguises, traps. And now she would search for the gaps, the names redacted, the codes rearranged to hide the truth in plain sight. As night fell over the camp, a single light burned in the back of the communications tent. Churchill stood outside for a long while, staring into the darkness. The wind carried no answers, only questions. But the silence was changing. For the first time in days, it felt like someone was listening. And he knew this was the first real step toward breaking the silence that had nearly swallowed them all. In the middle of a cold morning, as Churchill reviewed the early findings from Anaïs's investigation, a small envelope was quietly delivered to his desk. No markings, no name, just a single photograph inside and a message that would change everything. The image showed a snow-covered landscape somewhere deep in the Alsace mountains. Standing in front of a weathered wooden cabin was Bravo, the dog, alive. His stance was firm, his gaze steady. There was no mistaking it. This was not a coincidence. The dog had somehow escaped confinement, and someone had taken this picture to let them know. Churchill turned it over. Scrawled on the back in quick, uneven handwriting were just a few words. "He is alive, and he has the recording." For several long seconds, Churchill said nothing. He held the photo tightly, as if trying to reach through the image and feel the weight of the moment. Around him, the room stood still. Every soldier, every aide waited. Finally, he raised his eyes and spoke. "Not only men fight in this war. Sometimes," he said quietly, "the most loyal heart wears only a collar." No one moved. No one dared to interrupt what felt like something sacred. To Churchill, that photograph wasn't just proof of survival. It was a message, a whisper from the shadows saying the truth still lives. Bravo had carried more than missions on his back. He had carried trust. And now, perhaps, he was carrying the final piece needed to expose the lies that had trapped Nathan Ward. It wasn't just about clearing a soldier's name anymore. It was about reclaiming the truth from those who had tried to erase it. That dog, alone in the mountains, had become the last witness to a story no one else could tell. Churchill placed the photograph carefully inside his coat. A new mission had just begun, and this time it wouldn't be won with weapons or strategies, but with loyalty, memory, and the courage to follow the trail, no matter where it led. Winston Churchill acted without delay. The moment the photograph of Bravo reached his hands, he knew the time for quiet suspicion had passed. Now it was time to move. He made a direct call through the Allied network, reaching out to a name he remembered from earlier in the war: Sean McAllister, a retired Canadian engineer. McAllister had once worked on a classified program, designing lightweight cameras to be worn by military dogs during reconnaissance missions. He was meticulous, patient, and brilliant, just the kind of man Churchill needed. McAllister arrived within 2 days, his coat soaked from the snow, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. He shook Churchill's hand with quiet determination, asking only one question: "Do you still have the device?" Churchill nodded. "We have fragments. What we need is the truth." Together with Anaïs Fournier, the cryptographer already neck-deep in secrets, McAllister began the painstaking process of restoring the damaged files from Bravo's collar. Night after night, they worked in a makeshift lab near the command center, flickering lights, humming equipment, and the soft scratch of pencil on paper as Anaïs mapped data by hand. Churchill visited often. He didn't stand over them. He didn't rush them. But he made his presence felt, not as a superior, but as a witness. On one of those long nights, as the cold crept in through the cracks of the old wooden structure, Churchill stood behind the two of them, hands clasped tightly behind his, and back. His voice was low, steady. "Do not stop. Men are falling under the weight of lies, while the truth lies sleeping in digital silence." There was no response. None was needed. The message was understood. Hours passed, days blurred. Then, in the quiet before dawn, the screen flickered. The sound was faint, the image unstable. But there it was, a grainy clip, a snowy trail, movement, then a figure, Major Charles Whitmore. The video was short, only a few seconds, but enough. He appeared, holding a pistol, pacing near a small encampment, unaware the dog's camera was recording. His voice came through distorted but unmistakable. "Tremblay knew too much. The dog won't understand." Silence followed. Churchill was the first to see it. He said nothing at first. He simply watched the loop again and again. When he finally looked up, his eyes were not filled with victory, but with resolve. This was it, the final piece. Not just to clear Ward's name, but to expose a betrayal buried beneath uniforms and decorated ranks. The war had taught him many things, but this moment reminded him of one truth above all. Loyalty, real loyalty, never needed medals or speeches. Sometimes it came with quiet eyes and a collar. The makeshift courtroom had been set up just miles from the front lines, a tent reinforced with wooden panels and sandbags, filled with tension rather than comfort. Inside, officers whispered quietly, papers rustled, and the air hung heavy with doubt. Captain Nathan Ward sat upright, hands resting calmly on his knees, eyes forward. He had said little since the beginning. He didn't need to. His silence now carried more weight than words. The hearing had barely begun when the room shifted. Winston Churchill entered without ceremony. He walked straight down the aisle between rows of soldiers and commanders, his steps slow, deliberate. No trumpets, no entourage, just presence. Heads turned. Some saluted. Others simply stared, unsure if they were witnessing something official or something unforgettable. Churchill faced the French judge presiding over the extradition. His voice, though calm, cut through the murmurs like a blade. "This trial," he said, "is a disgrace to the memory of those who gave their lives for something greater than themselves, and to those still standing, it offers only shame." There was no applause, just silence, a silence deeper than any that had come before. Then the screen was brought forward. The restored footage from Bravo's collar began to play. The image was grainy, the sound uneven, but the truth was clear. Major Charles Whitmore appeared, pacing with a weapon in hand, unaware of the silent witness nearby. His words, though mumbled, were undeniable. "Tremblay knew too much. The dog won't understand." When the clip ended, no one spoke. Not the judge, not the officers. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Churchill rose once more. He turned to Ward and nodded with quiet reverence. "Captain Ward," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of the moment, "your country owes you more than a verdict. It owes you an apology, and to your dog, a medal." The judge gave the final word. The extradition was cancelled. The charges dropped. Ward was free. Charles Whitmore was arrested on the spot, stripped of his rank, taken away, not in anger, but in silence. The same silence he had once tried to use as a shield. Truth had been spoken. Finally, and for once in this war, justice had not been drowned by noise nor buried by fear. It had been heard in the voice of a forgotten soldier, in the eyes of a loyal dog, and in the unwavering presence of a man who refused to let honor be lost in the fog. The cold winds swept across the Alps, carrying with them the scent of pine, frost, and something far older, memories waiting to be uncovered. Guided by the last known coordinates from Bravo's tracking chip, a new mission quietly took shape. Churchill coordinated the effort personally. He enlisted the help of local resistance fighters, men and women who knew the mountain paths like old friends, who had once carried messages and hope across these same snowy ridges. But before the team could be assembled, Captain Nathan Ward made a request. "I'm going," he said. There was no debate, no ceremony. He wore no uniform this time, no medals, no rank, only a thick coat, worn boots, and the quiet resolve of someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. The journey through the mountains was slow, carved step by step through snow that reached up to their knees. Silence hung around them like fog, broken only by the crunch of boots and the occasional whisper from the guides. Churchill remained at base, monitoring every step from afar, waiting for word. Not as a leader issuing orders, but as a man hoping for closure. They found the cabin just past midday, tucked against a hillside, almost swallowed by snow and time. It looked abandoned, but Ward stepped forward without hesitation. Inside, the air was still. Faint traces of warmth clung to the wooden walls, and then, from the shadows, a sound, soft, familiar, Bravo. The dog emerged slowly, limping slightly, his frame thinner but his eyes bright with recognition. For a second, both stood still. Neither moved. Then Bravo ran. Clumsy in the snow, stumbling through the doorway, the dog threw himself into Ward's arms, letting out a noise that wasn't quite a bark, not quite a cry. Ward dropped to his knees, his arms wrapping tightly around the animal. No words. No orders, just a reunion that needed no explanation. A few steps back, one of the French fighters turned to the radio and quietly relayed the message. They found each other. Churchill received the call in silence. He stood near a window, the mountains visible in the distance. For a long time, he said nothing. That evening, as the sun set over the white peaks, he opened his journal and began to write. I have seen men charge tanks with bayonets. I have watched courage unfold in the fire of battle. But today, I witnessed what it means to be truly invincible. The war was far from over. The world still trembled under its weight. But in that small, forgotten cabin, a soldier and his dog had reminded everyone watching that loyalty, once tested, becomes something stronger than steel. And for Winston Churchill, it was a moment that would remain with him forever. Months after the final echoes of war had faded into history, something new began to take shape in the quiet city of Lille. Amidst the rebuilding of nations and the healing of wounds, Winston Churchill laid the foundation for something deeper than victory, a legacy of remembrance. It was called the Bravo Foundation. Born from the story of a soldier wrongfully accused and a dog who refused to abandon the truth, the foundation stood as a promise. A place where forgotten heroes would be seen again, where voices drowned by silence would be heard, where loyalty once ignored would finally be honored. Churchill had envisioned it not as a monument, but as a living shelter for justice. At its heart, the foundation welcomed soldiers who had been misjudged, betrayed by red tape and forgotten in the rush of war. Alongside them, military animals, often discarded once their service ended, were given peace, care, and dignity. The building was simple but strong, its entrance framed by clean stone and quiet pride. Carved into the front wall were the words that defined its mission. Here, loyalty has a name. Anaïs Fournier, the quiet force behind so much of the truth, became the foundation's lead legal advisor. Her work had turned whispers into evidence. Her conviction had helped shift the tide. Sean McAllister, the gentle engineer who had salvaged fragments of a corrupted recording, took up residence as the technical director. With his steady hands and sharp mind, he ensured no story was ever erased again. And Bravo, he walked the halls every morning, his steps slow, his eyes steady. Soldiers greeted him like an old comrade. Visitors paused to pet him. He became more than a symbol. He became part of the walls themselves, a constant reminder of what loyalty looked like when everything else fell apart. Churchill visited as often as he could. No cameras, no speeches, except one. At the inauguration, he stood before veterans, nurses, resistance fighters, and children too young to understand the weight of what they were witnessing. He placed one hand on the plaque at the entrance and said only this: "There is no higher honor than to protect those who have no voice." The room fell silent, not in mourning, but in reverence. The Bravo Foundation was more than a tribute. It was a continuation of a fight that didn't end with surrender or treaties. It was a place where wounds were acknowledged, not hidden, where truth was restored, even if delayed. And as the years passed, long after uniforms were folded and medals stored away, the foundation remained, not to remind the world of war, but to remember the quiet victories that came after it. The air was cold that morning, but still, not the kind of cold that bites, the kind that reminds you the world is turning slower now. Winston Churchill walked quietly between rows of recovering soldiers at the Bravo Foundation. His steps were steady, his expression calm. By his side, Bravo moved with quiet strength, his paws tapping softly against the stone floor. Some of the soldiers looked up as Churchill passed, young men with tired eyes and bandaged hands. He stopped in front of them, resting his cane lightly against his leg, and spoke in a voice both gentle and firm. "The world will remember the generals," he said, "but let us not forget the dogs, the prisoners, the betrayed, because courage is not made of speeches, it is made of endurance, and sometimes of silence." Bravo barked once, strong and clear. The sound echoed through the long hallway like a signal, not of war, but of memory. The scars of battle were still present, not always visible, but deep, And yet through all the noise that war had left behind, this story remained, carried not by glory, but by loyalty. As Churchill stood at the entrance of the foundation, the sun rising behind him, he paused to look back. Soldiers were speaking softly to one another. Bravo lay near the stairs, watching the horizon. Churchill turned to the camera during what would become his final recorded visit and left the world with words that would outlive the war itself. As long as there are men willing to speak and dogs willing to wait, the truth will find its way. That truth, born from silence, lived on, not in monuments or medals, but in places like this, where wrongs were made right and where forgotten heroes walked side by side with those who remembered. The Bravo Foundation became more than a shelter. It became a voice, a quiet one, but one that never stopped speaking. And for Churchill, a man shaped by the weight of history, it became something deeply personal, not just a cause, but a promise. Because stories like this are not just moments in time, they are reminders of what we carry forward, of those who gave more than orders, who waited, who believed, who stayed loyal, even when the world turned its back. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in his place? What other stories about soldiers and veterans deserve to be told? Imagine the final scenes. A soft sunrise lighting the snowy courtyard of the foundation, a slow-motion shot of Bravo walking between veterans seated on benches, Churchill silhouetted in the distance, writing quietly in his journal. Not as a prime minister, but as a man who had seen what loyalty truly meant. If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one. Until next time, may the silence always lead.